Bing bong. I am live with another State of Bitcoin podcast, running a little behind schedule today, but that's all right. So if you're in the chat or on Twitter, be sure to join on YouTube so I can see your comments. I can't really see them if you're on
You're in the chat or on Twitter. Be
now
sure to join on.
Hold up here, slight technical difficulties. I had some background noise, but I am good now. But if you're listening to this on audio, be sure to check out the Fountain app, Podcasting 2.0. You can stream me some sats. For those that have boosted and done other things like that in the past, I really appreciate it. I'm going to start reading boost and comments every episode. The one I got from this past week was Elobai. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they boosted the podcast and said, "Okay, let's go to listen to this podcast." So I really appreciate it. I hope you get coming back and enjoy this podcast. But I have a very special guest. I have Mike Hobart, who's sitting here in the green room. Mike, how are you doing tonight? Did I pronounce your last name right?
You did. Surprisingly, people butcher my last name, even though it's phonetically pronounced exactly how it's spelled. So nice job on that one.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know what's funny is like my last name is Keys, and I get that spelled incorrectly so often, so I can relate. Mike, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, like how you found Bitcoin in your orange pill story?
Okay. So I found Bitcoin because it was summer of 2017. I was mobilizing to go on deployment overseas, and that was when I kind of started to understand that I was going to be earning a salary that was also tax free because of where we were going. So I was like, okay, I don't want to just blow all my money off of deployment like an idiot. So I started looking into. I was talking with my mom, and because she held a senior position at Transamerica, so I was talking investing about investing with her, and started talking about how I just needed to make my money work for me so I can actually get wealthy. And that was also when I had noticed Bitcoin in that the spring of that year had broke $1,000. And then by August, which was a couple weeks before my mobilization, I would have been officially starting mobilization, is when I noticed that Bitcoin had quadrupled in a quarter's time. And so I was like, okay, if it's doing this, then people want it for some reason. So that was where I started digging. And then from there, I basically have spent, I think I've averaged 3 to 4 hours of Bitcoin content a day since August of 17. So, that's a lot of hours. I've never added it up, but
Yeah, it's probably pretty close to those that 10,000 hours or somewhere along those lines.
I think so.
Yeah, so good for you to put in the work and still loving it to this day. So that's awesome. So obviously it changed a little bit of your perspective, but do you think that you would have found Bitcoin at all if you didn't think your mom didn't have that kind of background where she was, you were kind of talking to her about investing or, what I guess kind of drove you to trying to figure out how to grow your wealth, other than I guess the tax purposes?
I don't think I would have gotten to that point. Because my mom was she was a huge mentor for me throughout my life, and I don't know, without being able of having the big picture, more wisdom centric conversations with her, I don't think I would have ended up there. Because most of my friends and family, everybody where I'm from just spends their money on alcohol. Not many people are actually planning for the future, and especially amongst the millennial generation back in 17. Still to this day, I'm just not part of that group anymore. But there's just a lot of nihilism out there, and there people just don't a lot of people just don't want to sacrifice the immediate gratification for future returns.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's there's an aspect where it's kind of interesting where meme stocks and investing has kind of gotten popularized because of the I guess COVID pandemic, everybody was home a little bit more, had a little bit more time to kind of look at these things. But it seems like everybody's kind of trying to find those get rich quick schemes. So it's funny because, Bitcoin was kind of that early one where everybody was talking about how it's so volatile, but it seems like now everybody's trying to find, the next Bitcoin, quote unquote. So, I guess, how do you view like the trend that this is going? Do you think, like the shitcoin trend, the meme stocks, like all these kind of things shooting up and maybe people getting burned? Do you think that's going to bring people more to Bitcoin, or do you think that's kind of like delaying everybody kind of finding their way to Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think it will. Surprisingly enough, it's a meme at this point, but like in my opinion, all roads lead to Bitcoin. And I hate saying those things because I have a personal like gripe with just like religions, like religion and echo chambers, and like making those claims like really does sound like a religious like kind of politic or doctrine, but because like when all these people, because like even right now, like there's so many weird things going on in legacy markets, like I'm sure we'll get to them, like talking about them, but like with the meme stocks or shit coins, when the sheep that are getting like lined up right now do get slaughtered, and they will, a lot of people will just quit entirely and they'll just give up. But then there's going to be a lot of people that start asking questions like, why did the chart look so good and then it just like sold off heavy? Like, why? Like this doesn't make, because that was a lot of like where I really started leaning into Bitcoin, like during the bear market of 17 through 19, like up into 20, like especially the initial like couple months where it like when it tapped 20 and then crashed to 12 and then back up to like 16 or 18 and then back to 12 and it like just kind of bounced around. Those were the days where I was like, those were the hardest days where you kind of just lick your wounds and accept the losses. But then you have to decide, it's like, okay, am I going to lean into this and actually understand it so I can profit better the next go around? Or am I just going to throw my hands up and go back to just playing video games and getting drunk every weekend? Like, that's not really a decision in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think a big part of it is just like education, right? So, the recent meme stock, I don't know if you've been kind of paying attention to it, but is Bed Bath and Beyond. It's been shooting up, and there was a lot on FinTwit. I kind of get both sides, right? So like some of my audience is more just financial Twitter, and some is strictly Bitcoin. And so it's interesting because I saw a lot of FinTwit almost kind of defending Bed Bath and Beyond, saying like, oh, it's not a meme stock. I think the former CEO like worked at GameStop or did something along those lines. And so they're like, oh, well, he's not doing it again. But it just came out today too that he sold all his stock, really close to the top. So, as much as people don't want to admit, like a lot of these markets are pretty manipulated as well. And, I think it's interesting because that's a big argument that I hear, when it comes to Bitcoin is that they say like a lot of whales, like, they name the Michael Saylors or some other people like that accumulate a lot of Bitcoin. And then they say, well, they could essentially control the price by selling it on or selling it off and doing all these other things. So I just think it's kind of an interesting time now because we're seeing a lot of other markets being manipulated. And, I don't know if it was quite as evident as it is right now. So, what do you say to those people that are, maybe questioning, I guess, the legitimacy behind Bitcoin when they, say things like, all right, well, Bitcoin's price can be manipulated by some of these whales?
I bring up the headlines from the past year that have been stating, because I was reading a couple Bloomberg articles. It seemed like at least one a week for like probably a month or a month and a half that was talking about how it was nearly all the major big bank corporations were getting fined for manipulating the precious metals markets, and they were all averaging somewhere around 200 million a pop. Like, people want to talk about Bitcoin getting manipulated. I'm like, this market is over 10 times the size, and it's getting manipulated worse than Bitcoin. Like, don't come at us with like that, because it's a total hypocritical grift. Like they and you bring that up to those people, and they're just like, oh well, that's different. Like, no, like look at diamonds. Diamonds is the same freaking thing. Like, it's all just locked up into vaults, and they decide when they want to release some more. Like get out of here. Like, and most of the time, you have to really start breaking through those people. You can't really talk from those terms, like I just said. Like, you have to do Socratic method. Like, okay, I mean, if that's your position, then you can't really invest in gold or equities or bonds. I mean, you before 2020, you could have argued real estate, but then BlackRock and Zillow started to break that. So there's really nowhere you can go to avoid like just people with deep pockets having power.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's just, a part of the fiat system, which is, just part of the runoff, right? Is like everything can be manipulated. If 60% of the money supply can be printed, in a matter of a few months, then, everything can be manipulated that is backed by that. And that's seemingly everything.
Well, and when you understand that too, you understand why the wealthy people don't ever sell what they're collateralizing for their loans. Like, they don't ever sell it. Like, they use the collateral to get a loan, to purchase more collateral to get another loan. That's precisely what Donald Trump does, and that's precisely what Robert Kiyosaki did. And that's what he wrote his whole book series on.
Yeah, 100%. And on that, I think it's kind of interesting where things are going in the Bitcoin space right now. So I think it's kind of dangerous because of, maybe how volatile the assets are right now. But what do you think of a lot of these products coming out with like Bitcoin backed loans? And things like that. Do you, I guess, foresee these kind of becoming popularized, or do you think like, a lot of people like, that had these loans on like places like Celsius and other places are going to get burned and, have to sell off a lot of their Bitcoin?
I think it's going to be both. What's going to be lopsided to the losers, because there will be stories of people that like happen to time the market around the bowling bottom of the bear market, that loan their stuff out to get a little bit more Bitcoin at the bottom cheap prices, and it's going to pay off for them. And those kinds of stories will stick around, and they'll be glorified in the bull market, and it'll just motivate people to do it again the next time. It's going to be the same story over and over until like the market cap gets high enough to where people can get enough of a cash loan with the like Bitcoin, because it's a pristine collateral. Like, once it gets up to those high enough of prices, then like it'll be more of a run of the mill, like kind of homegrown or standard like strategy for the average person, in my opinion. I mean, that's just following a sigmoid distribution curve. That's how everything tends to go.
Yeah, exactly. I tend to agree with you as well, as that a lot of these stories will be glorified. But let's get into a little bit more of your background. So your communications at the Great American Mining Company, which I think is really interesting because from what I remember, I think you guys were one of the first, if not the first, that started capturing flare gas to mine Bitcoin. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the exact history and genealogy of all the different miners, but I will say that I was an early fan of them, just because of like, not just because, but largely because of like Marty Ben's podcast. So when they expressed interest in having me come on, I jumped at it. I was like, hell yeah, dude! I'm not gonna say no to you guys.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, tell us a little bit about your experience there. Like, as communications, do you get to go to a lot of these mining fields, like, or do you get to, just kind of interact? Or are you more on, I guess, the sales, like, kind of business side?
I'm more on the forward facing kind of, working on becoming, I guess, like you could say, kind of like not quite the voice of the company, but kind of like a representative voice of the company. That'd be a better description. Because I'm also like, I've been, since I started at GAM, I've really been leaning in on understanding like the oil and gas industry, because if because like the way I look at it is, in order for me to argue the point of why the oil and gas producers stand to benefit largely from Bitcoin, I have to also understand the oil and gas side of the equation. So I mean, it's just simple math in my opinion. But it's like communications math. But to answer the other part of your question, I don't think a communications manager would be like going out in the field, but I specifically told the team, I was like, guys, I work out all the time and I've got Army experience as far as like labor and everything goes. And I worked for like the pipe fitters union locally in the area back here in Iowa. So I was like, I'm not afraid or like concerned about getting my hands dirty or like doing a little bit of work. So I was actually just out in the fields last week. It was a lot of fun.
That's awesome. That's awesome stuff. Yeah, I remember I shot you a DM just to make sure that, we were still good for this week. And you're like, yeah, I'm out in the field. So that's why I had to ask the question. So, I mean, that seems like some really cool stuff. So, I mean, I think it's really interesting time, too, for a lot of these oil and gas companies, because I believe there was a bill that I talked about last week in my podcast that got passed that $1.5 billion is being divvied out for these oil and gas companies to look into ways to capture flare gas. And so, it's interesting because at first, the ESG narrative was not super friendly to these oil and gas companies trying to even capture this flare gas. So have you, I guess on the communication side, seen a little bit of like a shift in that narrative where they're understanding like, okay, like oil and gas is not really going anywhere and we need to find a way to kind of capture this flare energy? Or do you still kind of see a lot of these red flags or, hurdles that you need to jump over for the ESG purposes?
The hurdles are definitely still there. Because there was also another article that I initially interpreted incorrectly, because I actually pushed it to my team, and it was an article from Bloomberg that was stating a court case against, it was from a state on the East Coast against I think it was Chevron, maybe, or one of the big oil companies. There was a court case. I think they were suing them for something. Don't like quote me on that, but it was with regards to like their environmental impact and suggesting that the oil and gas company, whichever one it was, didn't accurately describe the risks to the environment and climate change. So they're still dealing, because that had initially gotten thrown up to the federal level, and this recent article was just describing how it got kicked from the federal level back to the individual state level, which, I mean, is good for individual states in my opinion, because that means that the federal courts aren't trying to establish sweeping rules for the entire country. So each state can kind of do their own thing, and then we can start to figure out, then we can start to really get kind of like a good distributed kind of case study to start like making these arguments for oil and gas. But at the same time, I've definitely, to the other question that you asked, is that I've definitely noticed the tide hasn't fully shifted yet, but it feels like we're definitely approaching that kind of like phase shift potential where the volatility starts to really increase. Cause like now you're starting to see all sorts of headlines that are talking both sides of the aisle. And you kind of need that to start having people, like, once they start seeing the not all people, but the smart people, once they see headlines that are challenging their accepted narrative, they'll get curious as far as like the justifications for the other side. Because I was the same way. And like when over the last like year or so talking on spaces and on podcasts, like I've made some like pretty sweeping generalizations as far as like people and not wanting to change and all this other stuff. It's like I'm comfortable making those sweeping generalizations because I was one of those people. And like that's another thing with regards to like the whole fiat mindset, is not a lot of people are comfortable like admitting those kinds of things.
Oh, I agree 100%. So do you think that, because of Bitcoin, a lot of this change in the mindset is coming along? Or do you think, maybe there's some other external factors like, the potential energy crisis that we're in or some of these other, maybe macro factors?
Definitely the latter two. I don't think people would even be wanting to listen to Bitcoin miners if it wasn't for the fact that now all of the ESG proponents are starting to actually accept that we need oil and we need lots of oil. And there's also the dynamic of between the proven, probable, and possible reserves that we have. Like we have hundreds of years worth of current consumption of oil left, and that's just in certain basins. That's not considering all of the basins collectively brought together. So I think there's a lot of growing up going on right now, and that's what's leading to like people finally getting to the position of like, okay, if this is the case, then how do we incentivize more oil production? And then that's where entities like Great American Mining come in.
Oh, 100%. And I absolutely love what you guys are doing. And, not only for the space, but, I kind of pushing that, pushing that capture of the flare gas, because like I said, I think, from my perspective, I'm not sure if this is 100% right, but I think you guys were one of the first, mining companies that I heard of that was, capturing that flare gas.
Definitely the first I heard of.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's overall, I think, just great for the space. Not only for Bitcoin, but for the oil and gas industry as well, because I think a lot of people have followed suit. And, it seems like politicians are kind of waking up to this fact. But I guess that kind of leads me into my next story that I don't know if they're really waking up to the whole, like, inflation and everything else. Like, I think they're kind of scrambling here to kind of figure out ways how to combat it. So the latest that they're doing that President Biden just passed was a $430 billion Inflation Reduction Act. And if you're not watching the video, I'm putting in air quotes here, but 369 billion of that is to invest in climate and energy policies. 64 billion is to extend a policy under the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, and 15% of corporate tax is aimed at companies that are raising over $1 billion a year. And also last week, there's 124 that I covered last week. 124 billion of that is to increase IRS enforcement, which is allegedly to audit the rich. But if you were on the spaces or you check out my newsletter, I put in a map there that shows the country's poverty rate from 2013 to 2017, as well as the places that get audited the most. And you can see that they kind of line up almost perfectly, which is a shame, because a lot of these rich people can find out ways to get around taxes and things like that. Whereas, if you're not making quite as much money, you're probably just going to bend the knee. But, how are you viewing this whole inflation situation? Like I said before, I feel like the government personally is kind of grasping at straws and trying to figure out ways to combat it. But, as we said before, we've seen a lot of craziness go on, especially as of late with, since 2020 on. So how are you viewing this whole macro situation? And do you see any kind of clear path out that isn't going to be extremely bloody and, hurt the average American?
Well, the first talking point would be the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Because to further to your point too is I've seen a couple infographics that broke down how the taxing would break down between the lower class, middle class, and the rich, and then the wealthy or whatever. And the middle class pays out in taxes more, the largest out of all of those groups. Yeah, I'm pretty sure because my girlfriend and I were talking about it before this, and I think it's the salary bracket of 40,000 to 100,000, you're paying an additional 30% more in taxes or something like that. Don't quote me, I might be wrong, but it's clearly not they're they're clearly trying to. They claim they're trying to reduce inflation, but they're seeking tax revenue in ways that are, to your point, grasping at straws instead of just doing what they know. Like, I would argue that they know what should be done, what needs to be done, but they're trying to find every way to squeeze every dollar out of the population without having to do what they know needs to be done first. And that kind of leads us to the answer as far as like strategies to avoid either literal or economic bloodshed. You just have to start. Energy determines the price of everything, and the UK and the EU are seeing that like become painfully true in the last couple of months, and it's going to get painfully worse for everybody, including Americans, in my opinion, because like in order to relieve these pressures, we need more fossil fuels, and we need more energy in general. So that means more nuclear, but that also means more oil and gas, because like I think the U.S.'s exports as of 2020 were just over 6.5 trillion cubic feet for the year, and 64% of that is exported. And I think like close to 50% of what's exported is sent out through pipelines. So like, and knowing that this year is going to be like this, like going into Q4 and then especially into next year with fertilizers and everything, like you need natural gas not only to heat houses in the winter, but then you also need nat gas to help produce fertilizers going into the next harvest season. And the current harvest season for the U.S., I don't know if you looked at it, it looks like absolute ass. Like over 60%, I think it's over 60% of the United States is at least in a drought, if not in a severe drought. And it gets worse the farther southwest you go. And that's like, there was already articles last week earlier this week, I think, talking about how the drought down in Texas is slaughtering cotton yields. And I mean, it's like, it might not be this year, but next year that'll like start to impact the price of clothing and children's clothing. Because children's clothing is probably, I don't know the economics on this, but I know from my friends who have children is that's a huge cost because they're growing so fast. You're just constantly you got a high turnover rate in clothing. And kids' clothing isn't necessarily cheap either. And like we haven't even actually talked about the actual harvest for food. And it just gets worse. Because like at the same time, like a lot of the grain that we're producing from corn or wheat or whatever, a lot of that is also getting used to feed livestock, and that's producing livestock that are in a similar health condition as the rest of the U.S. population, which is obese, and that's what likely, in my opinion, led to like the multiple thousands of cattle just keeling over in that heat wave, like down in Kansas and I think Oklahoma or whatever. So I love paying attention to the macro stuff because it goes by without being heated by anybody because it's not necessarily immediately inflammatory. Like most people want to hear about how Kim Kardashian and Pete Davidson broke up. Like who cares? Like it literally does. Like that provides zero value to like or impact to your life. I don't know.
No, I agree with you 100%. And I think there's, a ton of underlying issues. And, my first thought too is like, how are we going to get this money for this bill, right? Because I mean, it's $430 billion. They're not going to get that all from tax revenue. Granted, they're going to try to get as much taxes out of the people as they can. But, like kind of like what we saw during the COVID pandemic, that just makes it worse for small businesses, right? Because now people are going to be demanding more salary because more is going to be taken out of their taxes. And businesses are going to be needing to have bigger margins because they're going to have to, those operating costs aren't getting any cheaper. Everything's getting more expensive. Gas is still expensive. People aren't really thinking about
supply chain issues.
Yeah, exactly. They don't really think about these, capital expenditures when it comes to a business, even getting, a piece of meat from somewhere to your local grocery store. Some of those things that people just don't really see really increase the cost of every good and service because, people need to make a living at the end of the day. Right. So I think, a lot of these tactics that they're using is taking money, like you said, away from the people and businesses. And at the end of the day, like from what I see, the government just really has a spending problem. Like,
well, and like, not to, I don't mean to cut you off, but like, and to that point, along the same lines as like that conversation, like that, like train of thought, like, do you remember a couple months ago, they also voted down to make insider trading illegal? So like they're all making however many multiples off of their insider trading. And who was the smart guy or smart lady that decided we should ask the criminals to vote on whether their activity should be charged as criminal activity? Like in what world does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean,
By the way, let me know if these cicadas are too loud. I can go on mute.
No, they're not too bad. But that's just from my perspective, right? So, but yeah, I mean, we had the Nancy Pelosi tracker too, right? That was like a super popular Twitter account. It had like, I think, over 500,000 followers, and then all of a sudden, it got banned because a lot of these things, like people, the average Americans, like waking up to the fact that a lot of our politicians are some of the best stock pickers globally, and you wonder why, right? Because like it's insider trading is becoming rampant. There's a lot of just, a lot of corruption to just say the least, like going on. And, things need to be changed, in order to help a lot of these Americans. And I feel like a lot of the policies are not really helping them. They're making it a little bit harder on Americans. And, on that note too, we're seeing a lot of companies too, like go through bankruptcy and a lot of crooked activities, right? So we saw Celsius Networks shut down withdrawals, and then they filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy. But they recently gained clearance to restructure and begin a Bitcoin mining business. So as somebody who's helping out the Great American Mining Company, I know, like, just from looking into a lot of these financials, like setting up a mining company where you're not really having great access to energy or just kind of like learning, getting into it, it is, a tough business to get started, to figure out those margins, figure out how to sustain machines, all that
mildly.
stuff. Yeah. And it's tough to start. And a Bankrupt Celsius is now getting permission to kind of start and ramp up that side of the business while they're still not allowing their users to withdraw any assets off the platform. So, I guess, how do you feel about, this whole situation with Celsius and, others that are kind of filing bankruptcy and not allowing users to withdraw, but still, essentially being allowed to operate their business and keep moving it forward, it seems like?
That's a really inflammatory question. I don't. All I'll really say is it's not how I would do business. But, and I don't know if you listened to the recent riff from Guy Swan and Corey Clipston, where they talked about like these particular entities between Celsius and Mashinsky, or Three Arrows Capital, or Voyager, or any of these others. But I'm also homegrown in the breadbasket of America, where like your word is like everything, and reputation is more important than what you like, whatever monetary value you earn. So I don't like Celsius, but like as far as like any of the, because like some of the mining companies, like I can't really judge them in the sense of like I wasn't in like those positions, like making those decisions. I probably would have made some different ones, especially with regards to the amount of risk and the timing of the year that they decided to like pile in. But it's also, I'm not the one making the decisions that amount to millions or tens of millions of dollars. So maybe there's a good reason for that, because some of these guys are still getting bailed out, and they're getting an enough amount of capital to, if they're smart, they can continue growing. And then, I mean, because like it's not ethical by any means, but if they do make good on their promises to where those people do finally get their funds, like that'll be the big one in my opinion. Because if they don't make good on the promises, that's the real decision maker. And if they make good on them, then they'll probably earn a lot of ground back as far as their PR goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I think we're seeing not only like, companies like Celsius and others who are just involved in the greater crypto space, but we're also seeing, a lot of miners kind of struggle to, some of them having to sell off a lot of their holdings to, manage their operating expenses and things like that too. So, I think the best thing that'll probably come out of this bear market is that a lot of these Bitcoin related companies that shot up are going to at least have to, structure and be prepared for, a next potential downturn. And so I think that this will at least, strengthen a lot of companies. And
there's a lot of growing up going on.
Yeah, because I think at the end of the day, a lot of these Bitcoin companies are like new founders that are, not really super experienced. Of course, Mashinsky's a different case, but where he's been kind of doing things like this, for it seems like quite some time, at least, from what Corey has been detailing. But I think like a lot of these Bitcoin companies are new founders that just had a love for Bitcoin, and so they founded this company, and they're kind of being taught a tough lesson. And at the end of the day, the underlying asset is extremely volatile. So
and the way a lot of their decision making was, it signaled to me pretty clearly that they actually believed that this was like the last cycle. Like they actually bought into Dan Held's thing of the super cycle beginning, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I've been told that I need to get better at it, and I should. But like, I never really bought into the super cycle thing. I was like, yeah, I mean, sure, it's plausible. Is it probable? No. Like, there's not a like. In order for like some sort of dynamic for that to happen, like you would have to have a cascade up and to the right of adoption. Like you would have to have whole ass countries and large portions of their populations just onboarding onto Bitcoin rapidly, like every day, in order to like actually produce some sort of super cycle thing. And even to that point, it probably wouldn't produce any sort of super cycle, because then people would be like selling off pretty hard to capture like any profits or whatever, right? So like you'd still like see bubble pop dynamics. I don't think there's any getting away from it until like you get to the actual singularity moment where you cross that threshold of a whatever the magic number is for the percentage of like global adoption, and then it kind of carries itself off from there.
Yeah, as much as we don't want to admit it, I still think like it's still kind of cyclical based off the halving period. Maybe it's coincidental, but just kind of looking at it for me, that's still kind of what I'm seeing. And I think the volatility has gone down like throughout the cycles. But I think like, it's still going to be a long time before we see the quote unquote super cycle. Kind of like what Dan Hill was saying, like you said, maybe we get there, maybe we never do, and we kind of just see these waves.
And like the other thing to consider too is like things could have gotten really weird if China wouldn't have timed their mining ban the way they did. Like, in all arguments' sake, but like in reality, we're never going to know because you can't go back and change time, right? So, I mean, it's very possible that maybe there was an opportunity at one point for the super cycle to gain that kind of momentum and fuel to actually begin. But,
Well, too, I think that there's always going to be some outside macroeconomic factors that we're never going to be able to call or know or understand, right? So,
yeah,
I think, like, at the end of the day, Bitcoin is still, as much as we don't want to admit, pretty correlated when it comes to a lot of these like growth and like quote unquote risk on assets right now. And so I think it's going to take some time, and it will be decoupled eventually. But for the time being, it's still kind of following those trends. So, once we get more people kind of coming in and hodling and doing all that kind of stuff to make it a little bit more stable, maybe use it more as transactions, more people are adopting it for that kind of use case too. I think it will, but for right now, it's still, just pretty correlated. And I think it's going to take some time to get away from that.
Well, and people, I don't really buy into the feasibility of the asset being asymmetric in how it like decouples or is not correlated to other markets, because it's just like a model, because like models only work when the majority of the population isn't like following or looking at them, but then once enough of the population identifies it and recognizes it and refers back to it, then the model breaks. So I think now we're to the point now where a lot of like enough people are starting to pay attention that it's going to be correlated to business cycles and debt cycles, just like everything else. Because the other thing to consider too is like what we're starting to see set up right now is how sovereign debt default starts to play into how the cycles act. Because like even if there were like small emerging market sovereign debt defaults, and it did push some portions of populations across the world into Bitcoin, like those markets are so small that like in all likelihood it's not going to be enough to move the needle enough to kick Bitcoin into some sort of like cyclical bear market again when the rest of the world is going through what is going to be a global recession. And if like if the smart decisions aren't made fast enough, there's very, like in my opinion, there's very much the likelihood of like falling into like a global depression too. Because like going back to the global financial crisis, one thing that a lot of people just, I don't know if they choose to remain ignorant of or they just don't know, but the people that actually pulled us out of the 2008 financial crisis wasn't Powell printing. It was China buying up our debt. Like they bought up like what, like $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion of our like sovereign like government debt. Like that's what saved us, because we got funding to, plow it into all those bailouts for those companies that didn't deserve it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100% too, and I think too, like it just comes down to the way Bitcoin's viewed, right? It's, are people going to continue to view it as like an investable asset, or more of the network, or the use case of transactional currency or other things like that too? And I think it really comes down to the way that we view it in the legal system too. And this might be a roundabout way to kind of get to the next story, but essentially, a Tornado Cash developer was arrested last week. And so if you didn't hear, Tornado Cash is kind of a mixing service, I think particularly for Ethereum. But regardless, it's one of those mixing services that allows you to essentially transact and do maybe like, I think it's like a popular one in Bitcoin is Whirlpool, where you can essentially, I don't know, I can't even think of the term right now, but essentially like help kind of make those not non-KYC, in some roundabout way. But this coder got arrested, and it almost seems like too, like because they're not necessarily viewing code as free speech, because he kind of allowed, through this Tornado Cash, allowed some people to, manipulate the market and kind of rip some people off. So do you think that like eventually code is going to be, viewed more so as like free speech? People can kind of code and do projects as they like, or do you kind of see, it going the opposite direction, where governments now are kind of waking up to the fact that, if you can code, you almost have like, all this power. So they're going to start to try to regulate, codes and softwares and other things that you can do.
I think I definitely think that they'll try. I to think that they wouldn't try, I think would be pretty foolish. But the funny thing is, in my opinion, is that the onset of social media is actually probably helping protect that. Because if they decide that text isn't speech and it's not protected by First Amendment rights, then like say goodbye to all of the newspapers and magazines and newsletters and all the like text messages, everything, closed captioning, like it would, like all of that would go. And I'm sorry, but I just don't think that there's enough Americans that rely on all of those services. I don't think there's enough Americans that would agree with that kind of determination. And because like that's an extremely slippery slope. Like we've been watching it for the last 2 years as far as like what's been going on with social media, like between just Twitter and Facebook alone. Like you don't even have to rope in all like the ridiculous mainstream media parroting that's been going on, and like how hard they've all been leaning in and like allowing the government to influence like amendment rights. Like it's just and like we're starting to see pushback. It's been largely like pretty quiet, but there's been a lot of people that have been it's particularly lawyers obviously that have been really going in hard at these government institutions that are clearly trying to influence how people like self-censor and everything, because it's still a form of censorship and it's still an infringement. Because like, and that's the other thing too, is coercion is a mafia business tactic. And like I would argue for the last couple of years they've been using their authority to try and coerce people into saying and acting in particular ways that may or may not go against their personal views, and that's wrong. That's wrong on every level.
Oh, 100%. And you know, I think it's interesting because I think, yeah, like you said, it's just kind of, it got to the point where, okay, if you're saying something against one side or some other side, whatever, and they don't agree with you, they're kind of okay with that method. So, example, like, when Trump got banned off Twitter, a lot of the people that I know from like the other side of the curtain were okay with that because they said, Twitter is a private company. They can kind of do whatever they want. And I was like, okay, well, no matter what side you're on, the president of the United States is supposed to be one of the more powerful people in the country. And now his voice is essentially being, cut off because whether you like it or not, Twitter has become almost like a big news source for a majority of people. Right. So,
Yeah.
I mean, especially like Bitcoin, Twitter, and other things, like some people don't even watch the news. They just get these little clips on Twitter or just catch everything there. So
I'm one of those people. I don't watch the news.
yeah, same here. And it's incredible that, these social media, networks and companies now have like so much power, and you don't really step back and think about it until like, something like this happens. And I was like, I had that oh shit moment where it's like, okay, well, if they can mute the president of the United States, they can manipulate essentially anything that we can hear, the timelines, the algorithms, like all that kind of stuff. Like, okay, it was kind of a joke to me at first, but now it's like, okay, that was kind of like a wake up moment for me where I was like, okay, is free speech actually free? I don't know. I mean, it seems like at this point, like anything is kind of like up in the air and can be potentially manipulated. And
well,
so
what scared me, like yours was the Donald Trump moment. Mine was the response to the particular health event that has been lasting across the last couple of years, when like they started like epidemiologists and virologists started like speaking out, and physicians were like, no, this is not the way to do this, like this is wrong. And when they started silencing those people, I was like, oh, okay, we are sliding down the slippery slope now. We're no longer at the top. Like we're into really, really dangerous territory.
Oh, 100%. And yeah. I mean, I just think like there's a lot of things, there's a lot of issues right now, like in the United States alone, that we need to work on. And, you know, uh, fixing the monetary policy, I think is one thing, when it comes back to Bitcoin and other things like that. But I think there's a lot of underlying issues that, are kind of evolved around the whole like freedom of self and freedom of expression and freedom of speech that, like that kind of, you feel that empowerment once you kind of take control of your money with Bitcoin. And, I think like just overall, we have a long ways to go with a lot of these issues. And I'm hoping that we can find their way back. But, I don't know. I'm feeling like we're getting kind of farther down the dark hole here. And I don't even know if I really see a way out.
Well, I mean, you kind of have to, because like the thing that a lot of the Bitcoin community forgets is that when you go down this rabbit hole, like the rabbit hole gets so small and echoey that you forget what it's like to be on the outside. And I mean, it's no different. It's just like that Batman quote from Harvey Dent, where like the night is darkest just before dawn. Like, because we have to get to the point of enough of these populations across the world. This is not just the U.S., right? It's everybody. That at least everybody that stands to benefit from using Bitcoin in some form or fashion. Like a lot of these populations, like these people, like they just have to get pushed to a particular pressure point or pain point or discomfort point that they just can't bear it anymore, and they start to realize that maybe the way that they're doing things just isn't the way that the world demands anymore. Because I mean, because like at one point, people have to think about how like I'm a millennial, so I grew up in an age where we didn't have Wi-Fi and we didn't have mobile data, and where text messaging was like all the rage, and where you would memorize like where the buttons were for T9 word, for those that remember that. Like you would memorize like the clicks it took to get to a special letter. Now like you don't need that. Like, and it's just people forget what adoption curves are like when you're experiencing them as they're happening.
Yeah, exactly. And what I think is interesting is that a lot of Bitcoiners are kind of flocking to Latin America, especially, countries like El Salvador that are kind of becoming, almost a little bit more free because they're adopting Bitcoin and kind of going along those lines. And that kind of leads me into my next story where, the Latin American's largest investment bank is now launching a Bitcoin and cryptocurrency exchange in Brazil called Mint. And so it seems like anytime I kind of turn in and look at these news stories, something big is happening in Latin America. So how do you kind of feel about, I guess, overall adoption as far as like LATAM goes, and the continued adoption that LATAM faces for Bitcoin and to a lesser extent, I guess, the crypto markets?
I enjoy it a lot. I personally, I would much rather see the people that need Bitcoin most get the opportunities to really get some sort of meaningful position started. Like, so a lot of them down there are using it because it's just faster, easier, and better. Hopefully some are capable of just like stashing a little bit away to the side. Because I would rather see Latin America, Central America, Africa, and that obviously includes, when I say Central America, I obviously include Mexico. I would rather see like the middle class and the impoverished in America and abroad like get positions in Bitcoin now and understand it before these big players like BlackRock get in here and start like manipulating these markets just like they've been doing with gold and real estate and everything else. Like, and because like I'm all for number go up, guys, but I would rather see everybody else get lifted up with the tide and not just the people that are greedy sons of bitches.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. Last week we covered, how BlackRock's partnering up with Coinbase to offer some more of these Bitcoin related products. So I think a lot of the big players are kind of waking up, which is unfortunate. But, at the same time, like, we had the high of 69K and we're kind of floating at 23, 24 right now. So, relatively speaking, it seems like it's a good time to scoop up some cheap sats. Obviously, not financial advice or anything like that. I agree with you 100%. I think like a lot of these countries are kind of realizing like, hey, we're on the dollar standard, or you're having these currencies that are, facing rapid inflation, and, it's suffering a lot of the people, like, countries like Argentina, Venezuela, that are going through these, crazy, fiat just ups and downs in their monetary policy. And so I think like a lot of these, the people in these countries are just kind of flocking towards Bitcoin. And, it makes sense, right? Because they're looking for something that, has some of these hard money policies. So I think that, Latin America, Africa, a lot of these countries people are going to start adopting it and kind of forcing the hand of a lot of the countries, which is what kind of seemed like happened in El Salvador with, like the Bitcoin Beach. I'm hearing of other places in like Honduras. I can't remember that. Maybe it's like Bitcoin Lake or Bitcoin Valley or something along those lines.
I think Guatemala might have been on one of those or something like that.
Yeah, so a lot of these Latin American countries are kind of having these communities that are creating, that circular economy where, Bitcoin transactions are going back and forth. And, unfortunately, I think the United States has the most to lose in this situation. And so because they have the most to lose, that they're going to be, I think, the most resistant to this change. I hope I'm wrong, but, I see kind of the United States not accepting, Bitcoin as a legal tender anytime soon, strictly because, they have the global reserve currency at the moment. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting development, but
I'll take the other side on that.
Okay.
I think I agree that the U.S. is in a position to be capable of losing a lot, but I think that they're also in a position to be capable of gaining a lot. And I've been talking about this for the last mosquitoes. I've been talking about this for the last year and a half. Because a lot of people, I think, forgot that FDIC was looking into Bitcoin to allow banks to hold Bitcoin on their balance sheets. And if that, in my opinion, if that were to go through to where banks could hold Bitcoin on their balance sheets, specifically central banks, if they were capable of doing that and those funds were, put up for FDIC insurance or something like that, like whatever they end up, the whole point is like if they were to allow it to become an asset that can prop up central banks that support, more fiat printing, that probably strengthens the dollar further. And the dollar's been getting strengthened ridiculously the last couple months. And so in my opinion, there is a possible future where the US co-ops Bitcoin to preserve dollar hegemony going forward.
Oh, exactly. And I think, that's an interesting point because I keep referring back to last week, my discussion with Phil Gibson, but he took a dive into the Federal Reserve's policy, and he thinks that, raising the interest rates and doing what the Fed is doing is essentially, just exploiting the weak of Europe and some of these other markets. And because US has this global reserve currency, they can kind of pull the strings. And so you strengthen the dollar so much that, all these other fiat currencies are essentially going to fail because at the end of the day, they're all backed by the dollar. The US kind of remains in power. So it'll be interesting to see, how it goes. We've had Powell come out and say that there's room for multiple, global reserve currencies. So maybe there's a situation where it's Bitcoin and the dollar, or the dollar gets backed by Bitcoin. I don't know. It'll be interesting to kind of see how it plays out, but I don't think that there's really a clear path, and a path that isn't going to be resisted by many, at least in my eyes right now.
Yeah, I agree. Whenever there's a network transfer, as far as because you could use a network transfer analogy for an adoption curve. And because it's always an overlap, one's going down, the other's coming up. And that always involves a serious amount of friction, an annoyingly high amount of friction. Because a lot of times for the new network or for the new adoption curve is it just makes logical sense. But people are extremely resistant to change. A lot of people find security in their routines. I'm one of those people. It's a very natural thing. And people get cranky when you start to challenge their routines or their entrenched ways of life, and Bitcoiners need to be comfortable with that, because we haven't even started the then they fight you stage. In my opinion, I don't think we've seen that yet. And if we've already seen it, then that was a really, really pathetic fight me stage.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. But I don't know. I'd be curious to kind of see how that comes, because we're seeing a lot more big players, like you said, come into adoption, right? So we've seen BlackRock come in. We've seen a lot of professional sports leagues kind of embrace it with a lot of sponsorships. FTX Arena, we have Crypto.com Arena, and all those kind of things too. And now we have the Houston Texans accepted Bitcoin as payment for a suite. And so they partnered with BitWallet, and they're now accepting, payments for tickets in Bitcoin. So, I mean, do you think like the kind of pull of a lot of these large corporations? Can you hear me? I don't know if I lost you.
There you go. You lagged for a little bit. I was about to text you.
Okay. But basically, I was getting at, I'm not sure if you saw, but the Houston Texans now are accepting Bitcoin as payment for suites in their NFL stadium. And so at the end of the day, like, do you think a lot of these big players kind of coming in will either delay or not even have the then they fight you stage? Or do you still think that there's still going to be a path where, governments start to resist?
Ooh, are you back yet?
This?
You're lagging a little bit. Technical difficulties. But I'll answer your question real quick in case it's not lagging from my end.
Yeah, I don't know. Can you hear me?
There we go. It's starting to catch up a little bit. But as far as I think it's more of just like marketing and virtue signaling from those entities. I don't think that, because like it's going to be just like Elon Musk and Tesla. There won't be a lot of people, in my opinion, that fork over valuable Bitcoin for a piddly suite at an NBA game. Because in my opinion, we're also like going into the recession. Like when recessions kick off, people have less time and money for paying for things like basketball games. So those teams are going to start seeing like their income reduce pretty substantially. And if their income is reducing substantially and they have less clients coming to the games to enjoy them, those clients are also, in my opinion, likely not going to spend that valuable Bitcoin to go to a game. It's good marketing for them, in my opinion, because it says it's kind of like virtue signaling, like, hey, we like Bitcoin. But yeah, I do still think that there is very much a fight you stage left, just because of we were talking earlier, like the volatility is coming to the oil and gas market as far as like the phase transition beginning to start and people realizing that they need more hydrocarbons. But there's still plenty of fight left before that tide actually shifts, and there is always the possibility that tide doesn't shift, and it shifts, or at least it shifts in the opposite direction that like I want, that GAM wants, and that the rest of like the Bitcoin community wants. And if that happens, like things get a lot worse. That's just the fact of the matter, is like, because like most of us know in the Bitcoin like space, like we understand how it incentivizes energy generation, and that is like in particular what the entire world needs a lot of right now. And if you don't want to accept that, and you don't want to utilize that strategy and really start like actually providing a force for the world that is capable of doing a lot of good, then things are just going to keep getting worse until people have that epiphany, like revelation moment.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. I just think, I think there's two interesting parts about this story. Like one, that it's in Houston, and of course, that's surrounding the oil and gas field, and there's a lot of Bitcoiners that are kind of flocking to the Austin, Houston area, what have you.
Yeah.
So I mean, it seems like that's kind of carrying over. And two, like I don't know, I'm gonna kind of push back on the spending of valuable Bitcoin, because like, right, what if they, say they give a slight discount in dollar terms, right? Where if you pay in Bitcoin,
that's a fair point.
I could just essentially just go on my phone, go to their sponsor, whatever it is, and just buy the Bitcoin immediately and then spend it, right then and there. So there's really no change. But, at the end of the day, it's not me spending the Bitcoin, it's spending dollars that I would normally spend. and just converting it to Bitcoin and just kind of converting it there. Because, to be honest, like I kind of had that first initial mental hurdle to get over when it came to spending Bitcoin as well. Because it was like, well, I don't really want to spend my Bitcoin. I just want to keep holding and keep stacking. But then I kind of came to the realization, I was like, well, like, at the end of the day, I'm going to spend this money anyway. So I could just like essentially convert it to Bitcoin right before and do it that way. So, I don't know, maybe we'll see some people kind of go towards this, but I don't know. What I thought was interesting too is like it's not the Cowboys. It's not like the most expensive franchise. It is the Texans, but they're also ranked like the 11th most valuable team according to Forbes. So it's not like the Texans are this small franchise, but they're not a big one, right? So I don't know. I think like you said, it's good publicity. I think they're supposed to be pretty bad this year too. So maybe it'll help bring some more people to the games. I don't know, but yeah, I think that there's kind of like a long way for not only Bitcoiners, just like people in general to kind of get over that mental hurdle of just like spending Bitcoin. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think like there's still, a lot of ways to go, or do you think like people are going to still kind of come to that realization that I kind of came to?
I think it's both, but but I do think that there's still a lot more weight. There's a lot more improvements to be made as far as like how to spend it. Because I mean, like, just consider like if you could somehow use your Bitcoin for DoorDash or Amazon, like a lot more people would be incentivized because it's also just faster. I mean, it's faster in real settlement terms, but most people don't even understand that like purchasing something on credit isn't settled for anywhere from 30 to 90 days. That also doesn't really impact a lot of people. So I don't know. I think you're probably more right than I am in all reality, because at the same time, I like buying. If somebody is selling coffee and they accept Lightning payments, and I have enough topped off on one of my wallets, and I'm like, yeah, I'll do that. Like, I'll show you something that's really cool. So yeah, I know a lot of these positions, whether it's on spending Bitcoin or on like the macroeconomic environment. I tell everybody that when I like share my opinion, I'm ultimately a Bitcoin bull. I would much rather be wrong in a lot of these positions, and I'm very comfortable with being wrong, and I would be very, very happy to be wrong.
Yeah, it's fair too. But on the Bitcoin bull route, a lot of us, we shit on all other shit coins, and I think right now I normally don't talk about any other shit coin on the show unless there's some giant rug pull or something along those lines that it's getting a lot of headlines. And this one, I just couldn't. I normally never talk about Ethereum, but I couldn't get around it because it seems like everywhere I go, I'm seeing Bitcoiners talk about ETH 2.0 and the ETH Merge. So I'm not going to pretend like I'm extremely well versed in Ethereum and the merge and the whole process in general. But it seems like there's been countless red flags with this merge, and I haven't even been following it too closely. First I saw that the developers flat out said that it will not lower the gas fees or anything like that. And so what I also think that is the biggest red flag, which is another reason why, Three Arrows Capital and Celsius and some of these others went down, is because you can stake a lot of money into Ethereum 2.0, but you can't pull out that money for what they say right now of at least 6 to 12 months. So, I mean, like, do you think that this is just going to be like the biggest, rug pull of all time? Or do you think like maybe there's some like legitimacy here where like, I don't know. Are you just like, I guess, basically anti everything else other than Bitcoin?
As soon as they announced the structuring for ETH2, as far as like I think it was like 16 validating shards or something like that. And then there was like 4 shards of those shards. So there's technically like 64 as far as the structure goes. And as soon as they announced that, and it was like for like how they thought that like the staking system was going to operate, I was like, they're screwed. Like there's no way out of this. And then when I finally understood that the smart contract for the upgrade to ETH2 was it was a lockup Like you have to send in however many and you get however many out. So it's just there's inflationary aspects around every turn. And then they're trying to figure out the difficulty bomb, like that's been a walking failure since it like went live. And now there's a lot of rumblings within the ETH community how they're going to fracture into the ETH2 hard fork, and then like proof of stake, and then like proof of mining, and like they're all going to have like their own like offshoots. And I was like, that's going to be the death of ETH right there. Maybe something will like continue on afterwards that continues with the mining and the proof of work aspect, and maybe they find something to work out of that. But it like how everything has been structured for the last couple of years, it's not gonna like how everything is now and how everything has been is like we're kind of watching the death throes at this point, in my opinion. And I think a lot of, and like to the point of your like answering directly your question is, I think a lot of people are going to get financially crushed. This is gonna be a rug pull, in my opinion.
I just don't understand how people don't see it either. Like I don't know. I mean, like maybe they've just gone along with the the sales pitch of everything else like that. But like I mean, I don't see how it's any better than the current financial system. I just see that people understand. Like I get the aspect of okay, you can build upon Ethereum a little bit easier than maybe building upon the Bitcoin network, but you know, like now that I have this podcast and I go out, I do Twitter Spaces, other things like that, like get approached by a lot of these people who bring big blockchain companies to me saying that, they want to sponsor or they want me to talk about it or other things like that. The first question I always ask is like, why does it need to be on a blockchain? And people don't really like understand the full like inner workings of it still. So I think there's like still like a huge knowledge gap. And I don't know like how that, with I guess the freedom that Bitcoin and the greater crypto space is supposed to, take your money out of banks, unbank yourself, which was like kind of Celsius's motto, like how all this stuff is just like, okay, it's the motto, it's a marketing pitch, but then it's like, okay, lock up your money for 6 to 12 months in this ETH protocol and everything's going to be fine. Like I just don't see how that connects in people's mind. And I don't know. I hope for people's sake in Ethereum that they are kind of waking up to this fact and they're switching over to Bitcoin and Bitcoin only. But I think it's going to take some people getting burned first, unfortunately. And I think a lot of people have gotten burned during this bear market, but I think that there's still going to be more blood in the streets, unfortunately.
Yeah, like it doesn't take a few people getting burned. It takes a lot of people getting burned. Because like I mentioned earlier, is some of those people are going to completely throw in the towel and give up, and then a even smaller portion of those people are going to lean in and try to understand what happens so they don't get burned like that in the future. And ultimately those are the smart people. Like, to be completely fair, and I'm not trying to insult anybody or anything when I say that. It's just smart people want to like smart people and winners, like when they fail they want to learn why they failed and how they failed so they don't do it again in the future. And like that's just a fact of life.
100%. And Mike, you've been very generous with your time, so I really appreciate it. But let's wrap it up here, and why don't you tell everybody what you got going on and where they can find you.
Sure. And by the way, it was a fun rip, dude. We should definitely do this again soon. What I've been doing is I've been working on producing I call it a report. I guess you could call it a report. It's an essay where I kind of laid out the current situation with oil and gas markets, and then I am making the argument for why Bitcoin and why oil and gas producers particularly should be very interested. We've got some awesome data on our end that definitely argues that point that I think a lot of people will like seeing, because we got pretty little graphs and charts. But then at the same time, I'm also working on producing like more enjoyable, just kind of fun blog posts from the GAM website, just more continuations of like the stuff that I kind of wrote for Bitcoin Magazine that a lot of people enjoyed hearing from me. And then I'm also working on another piece of work where I kind of lay out how the bureaucratic policy side of the oil and gas industry also incentivizes looking into Bitcoin. Because not a lot of people realize that, like, what the kinds of things that are going on behind the massive high school play curtain that is mainstream media, and like how oil and gas leasing and like the relationships with the EPA go and all that. So I'm hard at work. I can definitely I can promise you that. And then as far as like how people can find me, I'll post a lot of my for fun stuff on Medium. It's just at Mike Hobart. But on Twitter, I am at so THEE, and then Mike Hobart. And I like to keep it nice and simple.
Perfect. Yeah. And I would definitely give Mike a follow. He's on a lot of Twitter spaces too, always putting out great stuff as well. So you can definitely interact with him on there. And yeah, you overall put great content. I really enjoyed this rip. You know, I feel like we could probably talk about this stuff for hours, but I see it's getting dark for you out there, so I don't want to keep you out here all night. So Mike,
appreciate it.
And yeah, like you said, you're gonna have to come on sometime soon.
Hell yeah, dude. You just gotta let me know, and I'll tell you when times I can do it.
All right, man. Sounds good. Well, thanks again.